Our readings this evening are the first one from Psalms 140, verse 12. I know that Yahweh makes sure the poor have justice and defends those in need. The second reading is from Micah 6, verse 8. Listen here, mortal. God has already made abundantly clear what good is and what Yahweh needs from you. Simply do justice, love, kindness, and humbly walk with your God.
Please join me in a spirit of prayer. Holy, holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts collectively be acceptable in your sight. For you, O God, are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. On this Sunday, during this month of January, when we honor the work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I invite us to think today about how we can continue King's legacy by confronting the systems of oppression that we encounter today. So I invite us this evening to think about who it is that's existing on the margins today and how we might be agents of change, justice seekers, and more thoughtful people in relationship with our wider communities. So I ask you this evening to get in touch with those sacred responsibilities that King drew our attention to. The responsibilities of working towards a more just society in a myriad of ways. So I invite us to enhance our awareness of those who are weighed down, silenced, disenfranchised, and erased by the systems of patriarchy, racism, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, ableism, and more. So this evening, let's look for a bit at the experiences of many trans women of color in our country. In recent years, the number of trans and non-binary people who have been murdered have hit record highs. According to a survey by Trans Equality, 1 in 4 trans people have been assaulted because they are trans. The majority of deadly attacks against trans people are against women of color. And in many instances, the police continuously and consistently misidentify those murdered as men and by the names given to them at their birth. This appalling practice of dead naming is erasure. This practice is one that does not honor the inherent worth and dignity of these people. This practice does not honor the truth and the lived experience of trans women of color. A ProPublica report found that nationally, across 65 law enforcement agents investigating trans murders since January 2015, in 74 out of 85 cases, victims were identified by names or genders that they had abandoned long ago in their daily lives. If a woman who is trans is killed and reported as male, then her community may not be able to accurately be informed of her death, and witnesses may not know to come forward. This practice of dead naming and misgendering is trauma for an entire population of people whose lives are a constant struggle to exist and be seen and affirmed as their whole selves. But practically speaking, ProPublica says, deadly violence against trans people, included by suicide, is fueled by this kind of government action that legitimizes anti-trans bias by perpetuating the idea that a trans person's name and gender are not real. So I bring this one to our attention because this is an example of the multiple layers that go into the oppression of marginalized people. There are these really large systemic policies at play, such as those that the police are using, along with the few legal protections and accommodations for trans people nationally. And then there are all of these ripple effects, these micro pieces of these systemic practices, which translate into further alienation and denial of trans people's rights to exist in society and in community and in relationships. For many of us, some parts of our identities convey privilege and power and safety and security, And for many of us sitting here in this room at MCC Boston, other parts of our identities don't carry those luxuries and may place us firmly on the margins of society. I know what it's like to experience privilege. I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm well educated, I was born in America, I speak English as my first language. And then there's other parts of my identity that have resulted in an intimate knowledge of what it means to be on the margins, to exist outside of centers of power and privilege in certain spaces. I know what it is to not feel safe living as my queer self, having been married to a woman, what that lack of safety looked like as well. I've been threatened with violence, denied work opportunities, denied multiple insurance claims, made significant choices in my life because of homophobia and how that functions in the world and what I've faced. And that's having lived the majority of my adult life in the most progressive Boston metro areas. And my lived experiences of oppression on the interpersonal and systemic levels are not unique to me by any means. So many people in our country live lives firmly on the margins. So many of us here in this sanctuary. So many people live paycheck to paycheck, live without homes, live without access to health care, including mental health care. Many in our country are Black and brown people unfairly funneled into prison systems and living with legitimate fear of authorities and police. When I think of this enormous number of people who are marginalized, erased, and denied human rights each day in America, I have to turn to my faith to help me process where God is in the midst of it all, and where I can draw inspiration from as I work for change on a day-to-day basis. I'm a Christian pastor in the United Church of Christ, and for me, Jesus is the one who taught me that the God that I follow stands firmly with the oppressed in any situation. Reverend James Cone speaks to this understanding of God in his seminal book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And he wrote this: "The gospel of Jesus is not a rational concept to be explained in some theory of salvation, but it's a story about God's presence in Jesus' solidarity with the oppressed, which led all the way to his death on the cross. What is redemptive is the faith that God snatches victory out of defeat, life out of death, and hope out of despair." Friends, that's the Jesus that I profess to follow and to serve. The Jesus I follow each day is the one who dined with those on the margins and overturned tables. He's the one who learned from his mistakes and was willing to hear the story of that Syrophoenician woman who taught him that even dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall off the table. I fancy myself following a Jesus whose very death is a triumphant appeal to those who were oppressed by powers that be to rise up and to overturn those powers of oppression as he overturned death with life. My Jesus is liberating, resurrecting, calling me to keep the faith and address the oppression around me with humility, boldness, empathy, and a sense of righteous anger coupled with endless vision for a new way of living together. My faith calls me to carry out the work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the work of God in Jesus as much as I can. So I wonder tonight, what stories sustain you? How does your spirituality play a role? What art or poetry give you hope in the resistance? What keeps you working for justice? Who are your role models in this struggle? Where do you find the fuel and inspiration you need in order to keep living, keep existing, keep working for good, keep resisting the powers of evil? What communities keep you afloat? Maybe it's MCC Boston. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to his time and his context and his people, his moment in history, but he has a way of continuing to speak to us today. And as we think about how we live out MLK's vision that he set forth for us, I want to lift up the words of a modern day prophet in the struggle for a more just America, a more just world, and that's Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, known by many for popularizing the word intersectionality and speaking to what that means in our culture. And here's something that Crenshaw says: cultural patterns of oppression are not only interrelated, but they are bound together and influenced by the intersectional systems of society. Examples of this include race, gender, class, ability, and ethnicity. Crenshaw is saying that to truly understand the experiences of people, we have to see how the various parts of their identities intersect. What does it mean for us as spiritual people to be in touch with intersectionality in our own lives? I wonder. The lives of our friends or our neighbors, the lives of people who live on the margins. What might it mean to truly understand the nuances of people's lived experiences in America based on the intersections of who they actually are and the ways in which society treats the different parts of who they are? What does it mean to understand that to be a woman and a person of color and a trans person is a profoundly marginalizing experience in our white-dominated, heteronormative, patriarchal society? Crenshaw goes on to say this in another piece of writing: if you don't have a lens that's been trained to look at how various forms of discrimination come together, you're likely to develop a set of policies that will be as inclusive as they need to be. You're unlikely to develop a set of policies that will be as inclusive as they need to be. This brings me to think that we need to educate ourselves. We need to sit down, open up our hearts, and listen to the stories of those around us and the stories of those we don't find ourselves around. People with intersecting identities who live on the margins and live under the weight of oppression. We need to practice that holy act of listening and learning. And we need to take that learning and notice the ways in which our own day-to-day lives are acting to oppress some people and to lift others into more positions of power. And how might we use the power that each of us has in different ways in order to liberate? In addition to doing the work of liberation, it's important that we really get back in touch with that stuff that is sacred in the world. A couple years ago, I read a series of article after article about the decimation of this ancient cacti and plant life over in Joshua Tree. Stories of people just chainsawing through these national treasures in order to make it easier for trucks to pass through. And that just stuck with me. And then over the last couple years, might I say the last administration, we watched people degrade one another in public and private spheres alike. Human trafficking keeps going and going, and all three of these examples come to me when I think about a wider culture that is out of touch with what is sacred. So many people no longer recognize the sacredness present in each individual and in each living thing in creation. We no longer recognize the sacredness of elders and children and nature. So to live into Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision for our society means to get back in touch, in part, with our own spiritual compasses that lead us to see and affirm the sacredness, the inherent worth, and the value of all creation. So with that, friends, I invite us to go out into the communities that we are a part of, into the systems in which we each operate, and try our best to just dial up a little our resistance, to dial up a little our action of being agents of change. How might we honor Reverend Dr. King by being someone who sees how our systems of power further oppress people with intersecting identities? To live out King's legacy, may we be people who honor the sacredness in one another and who honor the inherent worth and dignity of all people. And in conclusion, I offer you the notion that each of our own liberations is indeed bound up in the liberations of all people. Each of us is only free when all of us is free. Amen. I love that closing line about this vigorous sleep, that when we wake up, we're that much more enlivened to serve God. May that kind of effect be what we get from worship together at MCC Boston. May you leave this place knowing that you are so totally beloved and that you are called to works of justice, grace, love, and mercy in all the spaces you are a part of. And that in each act of justice, grace, love, and mercy, you are not alone, but you go with all of us and with God. May you go now in peace to love and to serve. Amen.